we're going to explore what it means to imagine and then create a future without the identities that have been assigned to us, like so-called racial identities, with the express purpose of subjugating some and elevating others. Meaning the identities that get assigned to us, such as race, the express purpose of those categorizations has been and continues to be the marginalization of some and the privileging and uplifting of others. This is an invitation and a call to action. As easy as it would be to see this as some philosophical or theoretical abstract exercise that Sheena Mason just decided to embark on, I live this, I breathe this, I do this with students, I do this with organizations around the world increasingly. And there are ways that my second book, The Raceless Antiracist, Why Ending Race is the Future of Antiracism, explores how we can continue the applicability of what did start as a sort of heady thing, right? Maybe also important to note that my training. So I have an English PhD. I went to Howard University. That's where I earned my doctorate. And so I had the good fortune of studying everything Africana philosophy and literature. I'm a philosopher of race by training and a philosopher of race in terms of what I do in the world. And so that's why I remain obsessed with all things race/ism, because of my interests and my training. Let's consider this idea. Many of the dominant narratives about identity in the US are built around survival within hierarchical contexts. In the US, for Americans that get racialized as Black and other racialized group, race and therefore race/ism has long functioned as a way of navigating imposed meaning, who we are allowed to be, what we are expected to endure, how we find community or resistance, and what futures are possible, and even what futures are desirable. But what if so-called racial identity, as we learn and are taught to think of and practice it, is not an essence, but a story, a narrative, and is one that is designed to maintain lines of division and antagonism that actually benefit only a small percentage of people? Elon Musk. A story written into law, into science, into media, into our education, a story so deeply internalized, flawed, and false that even fighting against it often keeps us within its frame. This is what I call the epistemic trap of racialization and race/ism. It's not that race isn't real in its effects, it absolutely is. But the trap is that we start to believe it's real in essence too, which solidifies and reinforces some people as fully human, others as partially human, and others as not at all human. That it tells us something true about our humanity. And so we build strategies of dignity and pride inside the very boxes that were designed to constrain us, which, when you think about it, makes sense, right? You inherit the framework. It makes perfect sense that in resistance to the framework, you work still within the framework. But we could instead choose a different path forward by imagining and creating actually humanizing, just, and better futures for all people. Consider, for example, how school curricula, cultural holidays, and representation in media can appear to celebrate diversity while still reinforcing the belief that we are first and foremost racial beings. Or think about how political discourse can promote racial justice while implicitly assuming that the racial categories themselves are permanent, meaningful, descriptive, and neutral. These are often well-meaning strategies, but they trap us in a cycle of misrecognition that doesn't lead to liberation or justice. One question I want to ask is, what lies beyond the existence of racism and other hierarchies? What does it look like to refuse the logic and practice that says we must be racialized and racialize others in order to be visible, valued, or whole, or to acknowledge and grapple with the reality of racism? This brings me to the work of philosopher Dr. Leonard Harris, a professor of philosophy of race at Purdue University, and my mentor's mentor. We call him Doc. Doc offers a powerful concept. He says that dignity is not something you simply have because you're human. It's not intrinsic, in other words. Instead, dignity is what he calls a sortal or conditional, a contingent good, something that only exists when conditions make it possible. That is, dignity emerges only when people have meaningful opportunities to act with purpose, practice their gifts, develop aspirations, and participate in shaping their world. In this view, dignity isn't automatic, it's cultivated under certain humanizing conditions. Without viable aspirations, without agency that matters, without the space to reimagine oneself outside imposed systems of subjugation, dignity is undermined. In that sense, dignity is a practice, not a possession. It's something we cultivate socially, politically, and ethically. And depending on how you get racialized, you may or may not be afforded this characteristic called dignity. If we want to talk about dignity in America, especially for people who get racialized as subhuman, if at all human, we have to ask, what are the systems, categories, and habits of thought that are still undermining our spoken aspirations? Who gets to imagine freely and who gets to become? This is where I see a profound overlap between Narratives of America Project, Harris's view, and what I call the Togetherness Wayfinder. The Togetherness Wayfinder, this is sort of visual, also included in the book, to give you a sense for what's included in it. It is a framework. It houses concepts, philosophy, language, information, the racistness translator, and tenets. And this is part of my book sales strategy. I brought books for sale. I like it to be so small that only a few people can make it out. So you have to buy the book for me, $10. But just to give you a bit of a sense of what I'm doing here with this wayfinding framework, right? Like one of the philosophies, Ubuntu. A couple of folks heard me speak about this in one of the breakout groups yesterday. Ubuntu is a West African philosophy that translates roughly into I am because we are. It is a worldview. It is a way of life, a way of living. And I heard so many resonances between that philosophy, and Daniel, I see the smile, you get it, right? And what Daniel was talking about in terms of our rights and responsibilities to each other and to ourselves, right? Also along philosophical lines, teaching and knowing all philosophies of race. When I say philosophies, this is stuff we live, right? It's not all Plato and Socrates and stuff like that. This is like how we think, how we see the world. We all have philosophies of race, but we get indoctrinated into particular philosophies of race through our education system, the government, school system, religious institutions that help us to maintain the status quo even when we are fighting so hard against the status quo. And language components, like some people might mistranslate anything I say to think that I'm saying we should just stop using race language, right? No, right? We can't skip to the good part. Instead of saying a white person, Asian person, black person, mixed person, etc., what would it look like if we said a person who gets racialized as fill in the blank? That's semantic. Dr. Mace, get out of here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here. It's semantic, and it also has material impact, right? Because if we stop centering the dehumanizing apparatus, which is the race language in the first place, and we start centering the human, and then we're more clear-eyed about the fact that there are external things happening that's causing the racialization. Who benefits from that, right? Then we can start asking those questions. Who benefits from these external factors, et cetera? And then the racistness translator, I like to describe this as Scooby-Doo. Raise your hand if you've at least seen one episode of Scooby-Doo. Okay, perfect. Most of us. Most of us have seen an episode. So universal participation. That was good, right? So in almost every episode of Scooby-Doo, we're chasing after the villain. In this case, the villain is race, split right down the middle, black and white, says even race on their forehead, right? We're chasing after race for centuries. We capture race, and in every episode, what happens to the villain? Yeah, let's demask that sucker. He's demasked, and he shapeshifts into 5 different entities: ethnicity, culture, social class, economic class, or the causes and effects of racism itself. And by teaching, adopting, embracing, living out these kinds of translations, this is where some of the bridge building can come into play, because whereas something you said yesterday might have triggered me before I had this skill to translate race, right? Now I can translate it into what you probably were saying, right? You were talking about culture, you were talking about racism, whatever, and then I can receive it in the way that it's intended to be received, right? And that ability to translate proves really vital because of the difficult nature of talking about race and racism in the first place in a place like the United States, right? That's not by accident. It's supposed to be that way. So between the linguistic shifts, the philosophical shifts, the translator, and some of the rules that overarch the framework in its entirety, we can get a little bit closer to each other, right? And we can stop being so triggered. Now, in the breakout group, right, my hope is to talk with you about how, where, right, can we apply this togetherness wayfinder framework in our own spheres and circles. To date, I work with visual artists, I work with sociologists, I work with DEI practitioners, I work with literary scholars, I work with philosophers a lot, primarily, of course, I work with the Baha'i, wonderful Baha'i collaborators, Centers for World Peace at the University of Maryland. You name it, probably there's a collaboration happening. And so I share this with this as a sincere invitation. I want to hear how you think we might collaborate. And I wasn't kidding about the book. I do have copies of the book for sale if anyone is interested in learning more, and it'll just cost $10. Do we have time for questions? I know we're way over time.
We'll take a break after this, but let's just do a little bit of questions for Sheena. Thank you, Sheena.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. So many questions about the substance of this, but I was wondering if you could just share a little bit more about the application, like what exactly you do with these different entities, like what the lot of it in the application.
Well, for me, as an educator, I explicitly teach them this slide, like what's on here, right? So I teach African American and post-colonial literature at my university. So I teach them the literal framework, and then they have that in their pocket as an interpretive tool for engaging with the text that we're going to study. We study everything from podcasts and Jubilee videos, if anyone's familiar with those, to texts from 100 years ago, and where students are invited and given the tools needed to interpret philosophy of race, right? What philosophy of race is being expressed here, and why does that matter, right? And for philosophy of race, the philosophies answer the question, what is race? And the question, what should we do with it, right? So as we're marinating on examining philosophy of race in theory and in practice, they're asking themselves, what is my philosophy of race? How did I arrive here? I always have to disrupt the belief that race is biological by bringing in my geneticist friend, and he gives a good talk. Some students are still not dissuaded from believing in that. But then we get to the fun stuff of like, now what should we do with race, right? Because I identify race as a necessary component of racism, right? Which is a system of economic and social inequality. So to my mind, we need to abolish the belief in race and the practice of it. But you can't even start going down that path conceptually or even on a heart level with folks until you open the door to all philosophies of race. So I teach them all philosophies of race. In the class, I use the language of the wayfinder, right? Centering the human and showing that there's something external happening. We practice the translation. We watch various YouTube clips where race is being produced, and we think critically about it, right? Like, what is happening here? What do you think this person believes race is, and what we should do with it? And does that all inform your belief about race and what you think we should do with it and how? And because it may not be apparent, in doing it from this approach with this methodology, the result is for most students some kind of transformative way of seeing themselves and other people's in ways that are actually helpful to us as individuals, because racism causes psychological harm to people. So there's that benefit. It also helps individuals stop the root causes and effects of racism. Again, if race, the belief in it and the practice of it are required for racism to exist and persist, this framework completely disrupts that train or that cycle. And then they start to think more clear-eyed and more energetically and more positively about the kinds of futures that could exist if only more people could learn something like the Wayfinder, right? Similarly, I have the same kind of strategies with DEI folks, and increasingly education and curriculum, looking at curriculum design, teacher training, all of those kinds of things to help in those places underpin some of the core values of the Wayfinder to have the same benefits.
Any other reflections, questions? Yeah.
I'm curious to hear, I think it's so interesting. Thank you for sharing also about how you use the wayfinder when you're in the classroom or outside of the classroom. Do you see ways to kind of incorporate the way that you educate students outside of the classroom as we think about disseminating narratives or introducing narratives like this more broadly?
Yeah, so one exciting project I'm working on is a graphic book for 13 to 17-year-olds. Up until last night, it was going to be called Wayfinders Unboxed. But then last night, my spouse found that there's a movie coming out called Wayfinders. And I was like, oh man, I got to go do research and see if it's trademarked and stuff like that. But regardless of what the title ends up being, there will be a graphic book out. I'm getting more into film and media with fellow collaborators, because I think it's undeniable that those are important spaces for reaching younger people, increasingly so. And one of my long-term objectives is to have an app which is basically like a Urban Dictionary, but it's a racelessness translator, to where you can come in, you can put a direct quote of something like, what does race mean in this context, and then some way, somehow, the computer is going to tell you, like, here are the different meanings that this could take. That's one of my long-term goals, though. And then outside of that, I do a lot of community organizing in places like Mississippi and Arkansas. I work with cultural centers, the Freedom Project Network, and they work with underserved students there. And we've brought this curriculum inspired by the Wayfinder to students there, and to their programming there with great results. So I'm hoping to make connections with folks who are working with youth groups and young people to continue that kind of work. And if you have any ideas, let me know.